Let's begin our lesson on financial performance by thinking about the drivers of that financial performance, or of shareholder value. And let's start right at the top. What are the two goals of the CEO? Well, the first one is taken from the title of this segment, and that is that the CEO must provide shareholder value and needs to know the drivers of that value. The second thing is the CEO has to do this without going to jail. Obviously, there's a legal way of driving value, and there are illegal ways of doing that, as Bernie Ebbers found out in 2005. In fact, it's interesting, he got 25 years in prison for this, for $11 billion of fraud. So we're going to talk about ratios in a moment here, but maybe there's a ratio for the illicit way of driving shareholder value of a little over 2 years for every $1 billion of fraud you commit. But on a serious note, we are going to try to think about the drivers of shareholder value, and I think that these are really boiled down to three things: revenue growth, operating margin, and asset productivity. We'll talk about them more in a moment, but the nice thing about these three things related to the overall objective of this course is that supply chain professionals can affect all three of these, and they should be always on the radar when thinking about our supply chain strategies. Now, where do they come from? Let's start with the balanced scorecard. Kaplan and Norton wrote a lot about this, and this is a paper in 1996 where I pulled this quote. And they say that the measures of the scorecard must be linked. There must be a causal link between those measures of the scorecard and financial objectives. So they're arguing that no matter what we're looking to measure or analyze our performance of our firm, we should find a way to link them to financial objectives. And in doing that, they found that there's really three themes to those strategies that lead to financial objectives. And the one is revenue growth, which is a direct mapping to what we just talked about. Cost reduction is very linked to operating margin. And asset utilization is another way of thinking about asset productivity. In fact, later on in 2001, they published what they call a strategy map based on the balanced scorecard. And you can see at the top, shareholder value is right there at the top of that map. And right below that are the three components: revenue growth, cost structure or operating margin, and asset productivity. So you can see that the strategy linked to the balanced scorecard is driven by these three components. Of course, the consultants have to have their own version of this. They take a good academic concept and make it their own with a little bit different language. At the top is shareholder value. We see revenue growth right here broken down into both the sales volume you have as well as the prices for the things you're selling. Operating margin, thinking about both direct and indirect costs. And asset efficiency or asset productivity, which is broken down into kind of the fixed assets of property and equipment, and then the working capital, which comprises inventory, payables, and receivables. Capital. They have a fourth component called expectations. I'm not sure what that's about. We're going to focus on these three components, which are numbers that we can draw from the financial statements and do our analysis. If you also want to see how Deloitte maps all of their consulting services to these three components or four components and shareholder value, you can download it at this link here. At least as of the recording of this video, it worked. So you want to take a further look into how Deloitte sees all of their consulting linking to shareholder value, you can do that. Of course, when you have three components, three drivers in a business school, you need to make a triangle. But the triangle here is really important to emphasize that these drivers, there's trade-offs when you're focusing on these different drivers. And thinking about some supply chain examples, for example, we could think about driving revenue growth with having better quality products. So we're going to have higher prices for better quality products. But to do that, we may have to buy better quality components and cost of goods sold. And we have to make sure that the trade-off between these is appropriate so that we're driving value overall. We can improve one and decrease the other. Actually, the operating margin would go down by having higher quality goods. So we need to make sure that that trade-off is effective. On the other side, asset productivity, we could think about building additional warehouses to be closer to customers. That would drive sales volume. More sales would happen because we're closer, providing better service, but our productivity would go down because we have more assets involved in doing that. So again, we have to think about the trade-off of those two and make sure that the net is going to provide value. And on this third dimension, we can think about operating margins and say we'd like to have good operating margins, and therefore we're not going to take any markdowns or discounts. But if the product isn't selling very well, that could mean that we have inventory buildup and we don't get rid of our inventory, and so our asset productivity is not very good. So we have to be careful in thinking about when do we take markdowns to make sure that our asset productivity we're considering that, the productivity of our working capital, and may have to sacrifice some margin to do that. So you can see some examples of trade-offs here. We can also use this to position where our strategies are. Our strategies focused on revenue, on operating margin, on asset productivity, or a balance of those, and position where we want to go with our supply chain relative to these financial measures. This provides a basic framework for driving financial performance that we can link to in our supply chain management.